Welcome back to another Outdoor Philosophy, and today we are continuing our discussion of dumbing down our kids. This might very well be the last one of these, and so leave your thoughts down below as to what we should cover next on our Outdoor Philosophy series. And so we're going to I think we're going to wrap this up. Like I said, the next chapter is Goals and the Counter-Reformation, which we're not going to say a lot about this. This dealt with a law that was adopted in 1994. It was yet another one of these counter reforms. You know, we see some errors. We try and do some reforms, and then of course all the things they weren't doing were failing. And so let's do some more of it. In fact, there's a book out there called The Wisdom of the Anointed, which looks at the grand plan of, you know, it fits in the model of anything. It fits into education. It fits into health. Basically, they say we have this grand plan, and we're the educated people, so we're going to impose this on you. And then when everyone follows it and it doesn't work, then they say, oh, we're going to, people were either stupid and didn't do it, they were evil and chose not to do it because they're evil, or we didn't do it enough, the plan didn't go far enough. And so really this Goals 2000 was this thing to say, oh, we didn't really go far enough, let's push this even further. And so that, of course, was bound to fail, mostly because it had so many goals in it. I mean, some of these things would have, pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of goals, thousands of pages. And what ended up happening in the middle of all of this is it became so much in our school systems, became so much about babysitting and parenting. In fact, I just saw a video, I forget who did it very recently, where some people were like, the summer vacation is racist because it doesn't give low income and poverty and racial minority groups enough resources to help parent their kids. That's where education has become in our country, where in our country, we're starting to see the role of the schools and the role of education. And unfortunately, Christians do the same thing. We see the role of the Christians, that we give our kids out to the youth groups. The rest of the population gives our kids out to the public schools, and we're not taking as active of a role as we can. And then what ends up happening is this kind of fails because it's too much work for any person to do, and frankly, a lot of those tactics are best left up to the parents anyway. Not that the parents always do a good job, but he kind of ends with detailing some factors about schools that work throughout this country, and then talking about what we need to be doing with the coming educational reformation. So ultimately, a school that works, there was some research that went into looking at some successful schools, and these 5 points are what these schools had in common. They said there was a school-wide concern about reading skills, the adroit use of reading specialists, they had a phonics-based curriculum, close attention was paid to individual student reading interests, and careful evaluation of student progress. Of course, this is a study looking at reading comprehension. And what they found is that it didn't matter if they were inner city or rural or urban. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if they were from dual parent, single parent. It didn't matter if they were middle class, upper class, lower class. Really what mattered is these key factors. Do they really focus on learning? Which makes sense because in all of these educational reforms, what seems to be happening is kids are being pulled more and more and more out of academics. So while we're spending more time in school, we're spending infinitely less time on actual academics. One kid I was talking to, he told me he's literally in a counselor's office more than a classroom. And then of course they're like, oh, he's an impoverished kid. Just push him over to the corner. And basically the schools need to have a certain number of these impoverished kids to get more federal dollars in. And so literally instead of educating this poor kid, they were constantly putting him through these resources, which always caused him to lag behind. And the kid knew nothing about phonics. He knew nothing about basic skills, nothing about any of this kind of stuff. And the school was trying to solve all his problems. His problem was that they weren't giving him enough time to solve the school problems. Okay, they weren't giving him time to do the academics. They weren't giving him time to do what was important. And so as our educational reforms have added more and more services, we have pulled out of the academic areas. We've pulled out of mathematics. We've pulled out of the reading. We've pulled out of the comprehension, the grammar, even the critical thinking, so that we could focus on solving the emotional needs of our kids. And the emotional needs of our kids will be taken care of if they're getting education from their school. And then, of course, they went into a scenes from the front looking at this one super impoverished, super lowest end of the spectrum on the national level school from Maryland. And they end up getting a principal in there that actually was a leader and said, hey, we're going to look at other things. And there was a private school called the Calvert Academy that had this really, really high-ranking thing. And she tries to bring this in, and the superintendent is trying to block it, saying that's a rich person's, an elitist curriculum. And so finally, by getting support from the mayor told the superintendent she had to work with the principal, because it's like, there's no other option. And then what they did is they implemented the Calvert curriculum, and literally overnight, they became from the lowest of the nation to one of the highest in the nation in public schools. Why? Because it had a solid foundation in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The program uses materials of superior literary quality and stresses comprehension and analytical skills. Under close supervision, students learn to write with style and discipline. The principles of English grammar reinforce proper written and oral expression. Basic mathematical skills are measured so they become a useful tool in solving qualitative problems. Science, geography, and history are integral parts of the curriculum and stimulate interest in our world and in our heritage. Music, French, art, and history are offered to broaden artistic and cultural horizons to encourage creativity. So they went from this soft, let's solve all of our problems, into this model where they're just sitting back and saying, hey, we're going to focus on academics and leave all this other stuff later. And one of the things that they found was curious is that the kids that were labeled as the highest risk end up becoming some of the highest achievers with nothing more than a change in curriculum. And so that should give us a lot to think about. So he concludes his final chapters on the coming educational revolution, where he talks about reforming public education, looking at a series of tips. So he says this is what his tips are. This is what schools should do according to the author here. Abolish the education department in all 50 state education departments. Yeah, that's probably good. In state universities, abolish undergraduate schools of education. Repeal laws that artificially pump up the remaining schools of education by requiring or rewarding meaningless coursework or degrees. There are thousands of well-educated, eager, committed would-be teachers artificially banned from the nation's classrooms by restrictive rules designed to protect mediocre but credentialed teachers. Policymakers should break up educationalists' closed guild by allowing for alternative forms of teaching certifications. Better yet, they could scrap the teacher certification altogether, opening up teaching professions to non-educationists. And this is actually an important point because as somebody who, I used to teach chemistry, I have a doctorate in that field, and the reality is, if I were to go and apply for a chemistry teacher position at a local high school, and a history teacher who knows nothing about chemistry but has a teaching certificate applies for the same job, by de facto they have to give it to the history teacher because, oh, here's a book on chemistry, you just do this, because his teaching certificate makes him qualified. But the person who actually knows the material doesn't. That's what he's talking about. We need to get rid of that stupidity. Okay, if I have a PhD in a field, and I have taught at a college level, that should immediately qualify me to do any work in that field. Period. That's what a PhD is. A PhD is an expert in a field to the point where they can analyze and create curriculum, who can look at the connections, who can teach people how to work. This is not a low-level guy who's had a couple courses. This is a person who knows the knowledge. If I have a doctorate in a field related to chemistry, that should completely qualify me for any job in chemistry, any teaching in chemistry, anything having to do with chemistry. But no, our backward system gives it to the guy with a teaching certification in history because he's got a teaching certification, and the guy with a chemistry degree, oh no, you're not qualified. Why? Because I didn't sit through 16 courses of meaningless educational drivel written by a bunch of people who've never been in a classroom? Well, that's not sound teaching. And that's why our students are failing. That's why our students come out and just don't have a clue. That's the issue. Now he goes on, he says, pay good teachers more, lousy teachers less, and in return treat teachers as professionals. Make it easier for districts to close failing schools, fire lousy teachers, expel disruptive students, and eliminate tenure. Help restore rewards for successful students by allowing employers to use tests to screen employees. I have no idea what that point means. That's reading verbatim. And I read that like 5 times. I have no idea what he's talking about there. Okay, remove mandates. Schools should be free from requirements that they solve society's problems, environmental, economic, and sexual problems, and be permitted to get back to the business of teaching children to read and write. And that is ultimately the best thing we need to do. I go to school to learn. Let's learn. Let's not worry about all the other things. Let's learn. All right, so then he talks about some different classes. Innovative schools, like we have a lot of charter schools here in State College that some of them take some interesting innovative approaches. Of course, we also have a local law that any tax-paying person here, you can send your kid to the charter schools and not having to pay a lot out of pocket for it because they say, well, you are paying for education, and so the charter schools are part of that education system, and so the local government will help subsidize that. That is a good plan, and it actually has caused a lot of good charter schools that have alternative views to the teaching methods to grow up in this town. So we do have a little bit better education in some places. They talk about private and parochial schools, how the national average is only 23% of 8th graders being proficient in level in mathematics in a 1992 assessment, but 32% of Catholic schools and 43% in other private schools. In other words, double the number of people who are proficient in those skills from non-public schools. That should be a fair sign right there. Similar results in a lot of other places. Homeschooling, of course. If I had kids, homeschooling is what I would do because I don't trust a lot of these school districts and teachers. Tutoring has now become big, and then they're focusing on some things about teachers, and he kind of concludes with a discussion on the broken window effect, the broken window theory. So the broken window is, this was a theory that basically says that the more chaos is present in an environment, the more chaos will continue to be present in that environment. So if there is a building and a window is broken and that window is not repaired, eventually more and more and more windows become broken more frequently, more repeatedly, because that's kind of the thing that happens. People will say there's really no care. So Sykes applies the broken window theory to education and lists out a series of questions. Does the school make any specific mention of the disciplines? If not, that's a sign. There's no one individual thing you can look at, but he looks at a lot of tips. What proportion of the day is spent on academics? Okay, if it's less than 2/3, you got a serious problem. Do students receive letter grades or not? So as they start to abolish these types of things, what ends up happening is we see that education is not important and it becomes progressively worse as it goes. How much of his day is spent working cooperatively, and are gifted students given more opportunity, or are they recruited as student pure tutors? How dumbed down are the textbooks? That's a good thing to look at. So there's a series of these different tips and tricks in there. And that's kind of where he leaves us, is looking at a basic rubric for determining, is your school a school that is dumbing down your kids? And 20 years after this book is written, I will tell you, here in America, most of them are. We have a serious academic crisis in America, and we're not going to fix it by solving all the emotional problems. We're going to fix it by getting back to the basics of learning. So that wraps up this outdoor philosophy on dumbing down our kids. Once again, the link for the book will be in the description down below. This is a neat goal because this is actually one of the first books that was on my to-read pile. I got this book over 20 years ago when I was in college, and I finally now am getting to read it. Woohoo! Awesome! It's now off my to-read shelf. Definitely, it is worth the read. And honestly, I'm glad I'm reading it now rather than 20 years ago because I understand it now and I see what they were doing then, I didn't know was in existence, but now it's this stuff that's all in your face. A lot of the SJW stuff, he's tracing it through this in the 90s, which is just fascinating. But that brings us to the end of this Outdoor Philosophy series. Let us know in the comments down below what types of things we should be covering next.